Hello everyone, thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Kerem Oktar. I'm a graduate student at Princeton University, and today I'll be presenting joint work with Dr. Tanya Lombroso on preferences for intuition in decision making. Let's start off with a big question. How do people make decisions? This is one of those transcendentally important questions, the kind that civilizations throughout history have pondered and answered again and again. A recurring motif in this history of thought is the presence of two distinct ways of making decisions, one intuitive and the other deliberative. From Plato to Kahneman, scholars have relied on this distinction to parse the mind, though the names and properties attributed to each process have changed. Many modern cognitive psychologists view intuition as a kludgy system of error-prone but good enough, low-cost heuristics, and deliberation as a rational, systematic, and effortful process. Back to our big question. How do people make decisions? Dual system theory suggests that the answer is through a combination of the two, and data supports this view. We know that there is both individual and cross-domain variation in preferences for intuition and deliberation. But if intuition is so error-prone and deliberation so rational, why do people rely on intuition at all? And why is there variation across domains in the extent to which people do so? Past literature has explained cross-domain variation primarily from a cost-efficacy perspective, whereby deliberation, being the costly process, is recruited only when it's likely to pay for itself. That is, lead to a substantial enough improvement to justify the processing cost. In short, for some decisions, it pays off to use the better process. For others, it doesn't. But this cheap alternative view of intuition fails to capture some interesting data. Here are some of the first images that pop up when you search intuition on Google. It seems like people equally value intuition on its own merits, and do not merely treat it as an inferior alternative to deliberation. Lab studies also suggest that a cost-efficacy account cannot fully explain preferences for intuition. We know that people sometimes ignore costless information in order to make suboptimal, intuitive decisions, and often prefer intuitive strategies over equally simple and more effective ones. In domains like charitable giving, people prefer to base their decisions on personal feelings, even when objective metrics are made readily available. Once again, back to our question. How do people make decisions? It seems as though dual system accounts do not paint a complete picture of decision making, as they miss out on important shades of metacognition. Intuition seems to be explicitly valued and even prescribed by some people for some decisions. But when and why people value intuition is a question that does not currently have an answer in the literature. Beyond its obvious theoretical importance, this is a question of substantial practical impact as well. If intuition is indeed an inferior process, then understanding whether and why people prescribed it for important decisions may help us develop interventions towards improving decision-making at the individual, institutional, and societal scales. These are precisely the questions that we've been working on. The results of 4 experiments support the idea that sometimes we base our decisions on intuition over deliberation because we think we ought to do so. Further, we find that this prescription of intuition is driven by the perceived self-reflectivity of some decisions. That is, people prefer intuition over deliberation when authenticity matters.
To give you an idea of what's ahead, we will begin with Experiment 1, where we establish cross-domain variation in the prescription of intuition and deliberation. Then, we will transition to Experiment 2, where we explore 2 hypotheses about why people have such processing preferences, one about the relationship between intuition and authenticity, and the other about intuition and signaling commitment. In Experiment 3, we investigate whether differences in the perceived reliability of the 2 processes can account for our prior results, and in Experiment 4, we will see whether authenticity plays a causal role in the prescription of intuition.
In our first study, we set out to establish that there is in fact cross-domain variation in processing and choice judgments. Participants recruited through MTurk were presented with a binary decision in one of 12 domains, for example, romance, adoption, and investment decisions. In the domain of romance, for instance, participants were told about 2 potential partners, Alex and Taylor. participants learned that they intuitively favored Alex, but deliberatively favored Taylor, and were asked to make a choice between them. Further, they were asked to report how much they thought they would and should rely on intuition and deliberation in making choices like this. Across 12 domains, the core structure of the decision was held fixed, and we only varied the names and the context to match the domain. As you can see on this figure, both sets of judgments varied across domains. The processing judgments, shown on the plots on the left column, revealed that there is substantial variation in how appropriate people think it is to rely on intuition, with some domains, like romantic decisions, admitting a preference for intuition over deliberation, and others, like medical decisions, showing the opposite pattern. These preferences correspond in a straightforward way to people's decision-making across domains as well, as shown by the plots on the right column. The more intuition is favored over deliberation, the more the intuitive choice is preferred. Furthermore, there's a difference between prescriptive and descriptive judgments of both choice and processing. People overall think they ought to rely more on their deliberation than they in fact would. These results clearly demonstrate cross-domain variation in the prescription of intuition. But what is the psychological mechanism here? Why is intuition prescribed at all? Our first hypothesis was that people may consider reliance on intuition appropriate when they think that a decision should be made in a self-reflective or authentic manner. After all, a few studies have found a connection between people's judgments of self-reflectiveness of certain thoughts and their intuitive spontaneity. Second, we consider the possibility that people may think they ought to rely on their intuition in some domains because reliance on intuition is seen as a social signal of commitment to or confidence in one's values. This is related to a body of work showing that people consider others who deliberate for certain moral decisions to be less committed to their values than those who make the right choices intuitively. To test these hypotheses, we conducted an experiment in which we used modified versions of the vignettes from our first study. Instead of the participant choosing between two options, a character makes a decision between the same options, given the same information. We varied between subjects whether the character pursued the intuitive or the deliberative option, and once again varied which one of 12 domains participants were assigned to. As we can see on the top four plots, intuitive decision makers, indicated by the gray bars, were on average seen as both more committed and authentic across domains than deliberative decision makers, shown by the black bars. However, when we examine the breakdown of these judgments by domain, as shown on the bottom plots, we observe an interesting trend. Only authenticity ratings showed variation across domains that was significantly correlated with the prescribed roles for intuition and deliberation from study 1. That is, intuitive decision makers were generally regarded as more authentic, but this perception was heightened in domains for which intuition is thought to be an appropriate basis for choice. Though this work was valuable in exploring potential connections between intuitive choice, signaling, and authenticity, it had an important shortcoming. Across the vignettes we used in these past experiments, there were always two choices, one supported by intuition and the other by deliberation. This presents a confound. To the extent that intuition is simply taken to be a more reliable decision-making process in some domains, we may expect this reliability to be correlated with a whole host of other inferences. For instance, that the decision was more authentic. Therefore, moving past this prior work, we wanted to explore whether even holding the option favored by the process constant, the mere act of differentially basing a decision on intuition or deliberation may lead to different inferences across domains. To get around the reliability confound, in study 3, participants read scenarios in 3 domains where people's intuitive and deliberative evaluations of their two options both point to the same choice. In this experiment, unlike our prior studies, 2 characters face identical decision scenarios. Sarah faces a choice between Alex and Taylor, and Casey between Sam and Jack. For both characters, intuition and deliberation point to the same choice, and both characters have essentially the same information when they're making both decisions. However, the 2 characters decide to base their decisions on either intuition or deliberation. Thus, if participants evaluate the 2 decision makers differently, this must reflect the effective decision basis alone. In accordance with our previous results, we found that decision makers who based their decisions on intuition in domains like romance were thought to have made more authentic decisions, but that reliance on intuition in domains like investment were not associated with authenticity. You can see these differences as deviations from the midpoint, shown by the dashed line. The scale goes from definitely the deliberative decision maker to definitely the intuitive decision maker, and each DV is broken up by domain. The bars therefore correspond to the average rating for that DV by domain. Interestingly, we found a domain-independent boost for intuition in our self-reflection measure. We also observed an expected effect on reliability, whereby decision makers that relied on domain-appropriate processes were thought to have made more reliable decisions. As hypothesized, reliability judgments were not strongly correlated with authenticity judgments. Finally, ruling out the possibility that intuition is simply associated with positive and social virtues, we did not find any effect on how committed or confident decision makers were perceived as being across domains. In sum, the results of this experiment support the hypothesis that decision makers are evaluated differently depending on the basis for their decisions, even when basis is unconfounded from the cost of deliberation, the choice to deliberate, and the evidence for choice quality suggested by each process's output. Moreover, this evaluation varies by domain, with authenticity uniquely tracking the prescribed role of intuition in a domain-dependent manner. Despite establishing the existence of a robust relationship between the prescription of intuition and authenticity, none of our prior studies can speak to a causal relation, as we did not directly manipulate authenticity. Therefore, in our final experiment, we investigated whether authenticity plays a causal role in driving prescriptive processing preferences. In order to test this hypothesis, we designed an experiment where we simply manipulated how authentic a relatively underspecified decision was, holding all else constant. So in the experiment, participants read that Alex thinks that it is either extremely important or not important at all that he makes this decision in a way that reflects his true, authentic self. Participants then responded to the intuition and deliberation items from our previous studies, in addition to objectivity, complexity, and expertise items, as well as 2 advice-seeking items, one about advice seeking from humans and the other from AI. These were all presented in a random order and with Likert scales from strongly disagree to strongly agree. We found that this simple manipulation had drastic effects on the prescription of intuition, with more intuition being prescribed for more authentic decisions, though there was little effect on deliberation. This relationship was found even when we controlled for effects on previously established factors, like objectivity, complexity, and expertise. Finally, we found downstream consequences on advice-seeking, with advice from both humans and AI being dispreferred for authentic decisions. The effects on advice-seeking were also found to be robust to the inclusion of covariates. These analyses confirm my hypothesis that manipulating authenticity not only has a causal impact on processing judgments, but also has downstream effects on cognition. We started this presentation with one of the big questions of psychology. How do people make decisions? We went over how dual system theories of cognition try to answer that question, and saw how their treatment of intuition as an inferior process clashes with the full psychological evaluation of intuition. We then examined the results of 4 experiments, which cumulatively demonstrated 3 key insights. First, people rely on intuition for some decisions, but not others, because they think they ought to do so, not simply because intuition is cheap. Second, this prescription of intuition is driven by the perceived authenticity of some decisions. Third, the prescription of intuition has downstream effects on impactful processes, like advice seeking. These results raise many interesting questions. Most obviously, why is there this relationship between intuition and authenticity? What do people mean when they talk about authenticity at all? Could intuition play a foundational role in the establishment of preferences and identity? And can we leverage our findings here to develop interventions aimed towards improving critical thinking? With that, I would like to thank you for listening, members of the Concepts and Cognition Lab for their valuable input, and the Reboot Foundation for their generous support. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, and I hope you have a great CogSci 2021. Thank you.